So welcome everybody. This is the first inaugural seminar series within the Next Gen initiative of the BCI Society. My name is Davide Valeriani. I am a postdoc at Maastricht here, and I'm also the chair of the student and postdoc committee within the BCI Society. And it's my great pleasure today to welcome our first speaker, Christian Herff, talking about machine learning for BCI. So Dr. Herff is an assistant professor in the School for Mental Health and Neuroscience at Maastricht University. And he's leading the invasive BCI research line. And his research interest lays in the application of machine learning technology, which will be the subject today, to neurophysiological data for brain-computer interfaces and neuroscience research. Before passing the virtual stage to Christian here, I just want to say a couple of things about this series. So BCI Society is pushing to creating and organizing new initiatives, virtual initiatives throughout the year, and this next generation is a seminar series for both technical and career development talks and panels and discussions open to everybody for trainees and more advanced as well BCI researchers. If you are interested in presenting or in helping out with the BCI Society, feel free to reach out through our website, bcisociety.org. And if you are tweeting or using social media within this presentation, remember to use the hashtag that is at the bottom right, BCI Thursdays. And a final note, if you have, so the presentation will last about 30 minutes, and then we'll have like questions at the end of it. Feel free to use the button at the bottom of your screen for submitting your questions, or type them in the chat, whatever is easier for you, and we'll answer as many questions as possible at the end. So with that, without further ado, I leave the stage to Christian. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for the really kind introduction. I feel very honored to give this inaugural session in the BCI Thursdays for the next generation. And I will be talking about machine learning for BCI today. And I must admit, it was very hard for me to prepare this presentation. I've given a lot of lectures about machine learning for BCI, but usually that's 12 times 90 minutes over an entire semester. So boiling that down to 30 minutes for a group with very diverse backgrounds, with very different stages of their career, was actually quite a challenge. So what I try to do here is introduce the main concepts, give you some of the lingo we use in machine learning, and then just pointing you in the right directions, because in 30 minutes, I believe there's not much more that is possible. If after this discussion and presentation, you still want to talk about something, feel free to reach out either via Twitter or via my email address, which you can see down here. So I think machine learning is an elementary part of BCI. We all know that a BCI measures some sort of brain activity, and what brain activity we consider really doesn't make a difference for BCIs. We then do the necessary signal processing and extract meaningful features. And all of these parts will be spoken about in one of the later lectures. Now, in the decoding stage is where the machine learning magic happens. It translates those meaningful feature vectors into an output that can be used in the application for our patient in the end. So in this decoding stage is really where machine learning plays its role in BCI. In machine learning in general, we try to categorize problems into two different problem types. The first one is classification. In classification, we predict one class from a set of classes from the input vectors. To give you examples, we could predict, is it is the person imagining to move their left hand or imagining to move their right hand in a motor imagery task, one of the best known BCI paradigms. So the two classes, a set of classes is left and right, and our classifier predicts, is the patient thinking of left hand imagery or right hand imagery? In an example with more classes from a very recent paper by the BrainGate group, the patient was imagining to write a letter, and the classifier was then saying which out of all of the letters that could be written the person was trying to write down now. In another two-class example, we have the very popular P300 speller on the right. So the P300 speller can spell out 36 different letters, as you can see here, 6 by 6. But the classification is actually a two-class problem. It just classifies, is the patient focusing on this row or column, or are they not focusing on it? So just yes or no. Whenever I do a classification problem, I need to know how good we're doing. And in classification, the easiest evaluation criteria is the accuracy. The accuracy just tells us how often was I correct out of the total number of decisions I made. Now, if I have a large number of classes, like for example in the handwriting decoding from the previous slide, just the plain accuracy isn't very meaningful. So, and this is also true if we have very unbalanced classes. For example, in the P300 speller, we have a lot more misses than we have targets. So it is often very helpful in classification to look at the confusion matrix. In the confusion matrix, we see what the classifier predicted here on the x-axis versus what the reference, what was originally intended here on the y-axis. This is often done with colors, and in an ideal world, we would have high numbers only on the diagonal. Of course, especially in BCIs, we often make mistakes, and we can then see where the classifier makes mistakes. For example, in this study from my colleagues and me, we see that I and J are very often not recognized as themselves, and that the classifier instead thinks it's a silence or an R. This was a speech decoding task from brain signals. The second category of machine learning problems we faced in BCIs is regression. In regression, we predict a continuous variable for each input vector. So instead of saying left or right, for example, we can predict how far to the left or how far to the right a robotic arm shall move, or shall even move in three-dimensional space, as you can see in this study by Edelman on the right. Another example for a regression task is one of our studies again, where we predicted continuous spectrograms of speech from invasive brain data. So instead of 2 or 3 or a number of classes, we predict continuous values in regression tasks. Again, we need to evaluate how well we did. We again do this by comparing what was intended to what was decoded. You can see this in this example from Gernot Müller-Putz group. On the top, you see the target cursor positions that needed to be decoded in EEG here. And then the decoding of several decoding algorithms, Kalman filter, an unscented Kalman filter, and so forth. We can then compare the two trajectories, so the real one and the predicted one, for example, using a standard correlation. Here is a Pearson correlation, or a mean squared error between the target and the prediction by just comparing them sample-wise. Now, especially in machine learning, I think it's super important to, in BCI, it's super important to understand that we don't always need to do machine learning. We can also build knowledge-based systems. And I'm giving you 2 examples here, how we can do fantastic BCIs without needing machine learning at all. For example, from the literature, we know that when we're moving our right hand or imagining to move our right hand, we will have a strong decrease in beta power. This is called the movement-related desynchronization, and you can see it here. This is frequency on the x-axis. In between 13 and 30 hertz, we see a much lower energy in the frequency than during rest. We know also this must happen on the left motor cortex because the limbs are controlled contralaterally. So we could just build a knowledge-based system saying, when on this electrode, the power is below a certain level, it must be imagined left hand movement. And if it's above this threshold, there is no imagined movement. We do the same for an electrode on the other brain side, and we have a motor imagery BCI, and this will work very well. I mean, it might sound super simple, but in reality, these approaches often perform astonishingly well. Of course, such a knowledge-based system is also possible for regression. From the 80s, we know that neurons in the motor cortex exhibit a so-called cosine tuning. So the firing of certain neurons depends on the cosine of the direction from their preferred direction. So if we figure this out for a certain neuron, we can just say, okay, this neuron fires this much, so it must mean we are at 100 degrees of the preferred direction. So the participant, or in this case monkey, wanted to move the cursor that way. So by simply including knowledge about neuroscience, we can build very strong decoders and don't need to rely on machine learning. But what is machine learning then? The earliest definition of machine learning I could find is by Arthur Samuel from the late 50s. He worked on teaching computers to play checkers, which you see on the bottom here. He didn't succeed. His programs were still worse than human players, but checkers was one of the first games that was solved by AIs a little later. And he defined machine learning as the field of study that gives computers the ability to learn without being explicitly programmed. Now, the explicitly programming is exactly what we did in the previous slide. So the knowledge-based systems are not machine learning, but what is it then? Arthur Samuel's definition doesn't tell us that. And for that, I would like to jump to a bit more modern definition of machine learning by Tom Mitchell from the late 90s, 40 years later. And he said a well-posed learning problem is a computer program is set to learn from experience E with respect to some task T and some performance measure P if its performance on T, as measured by P, improves with experience E. Now, what does that mean? The experience E is the training data in our machine learning task. So we have to have some sort of data on which we train our algorithm. Our task T is one of the is your machine learning task in the BCI. For example, the motor imagery I showed on the first slide, or it could be the decoding of the handwritten letters I showed later, or maybe the speech decoding from one of my studies. The performance measure P then would be for a classification task, could be accuracy, for example, or for a regression task, a simple Pearson correlation. So if the performance gets better with training data as opposed to without training data in one of our tasks, we're talking about machine learning. How does that happen in the normal machine learning community? What's usually done in machine learning is that people work on open loop data. So they have some sort of data set that they previously collected or downloaded from the internet. The BCI competition 4, for example, is very popular for this. And then they simulate to have new unseen data. If we have very big data sets, we can just take a part and use it as test data. But usually what we do is we simulate to have unseen data, and we do this with cross-validation. So what we do is we take some part of the data and say, now this part is my training data. And the little bit remaining is the testing data. I train my machine learner on this, evaluate the performance P on this, and then say, okay, it's this and this good. And iteratively now, I repeat this process. In the next step, this is a test data and all the remainder is a training data. And I repeat this until each bit of data in the data set was used as testing data exactly once. I can then average over all these iterations and say, my machine learning algorithm is this and this good in discriminating left and right hand motor imagery from the neural data. This is super important and has advanced the field a lot, but this is not what we need to do in brain-computer interfacing. What we do in brain-computer interfacing is we have a training phase in which we tell our participant, you see the participant here, what they have to do. So in BCIs, usually we can't start right away. We need to collect the training data first. So in the training phase, we tell the participants what to do. For example, here I tell the participant, now imagine moving your left hand. Now imagine moving your right hand. Imagine moving your right hand again. And in the end, move your left hand. I now have parallel training data. I have the data, which we usually call X, and where I have the corresponding label Y. So I know this data corresponds to right, this to left, and this to right. And by using this parallel data, for which I know what the real label was, I can train the machine learning model. We will get into the models a bit later. After the model is trained, we can now get to the actual BCI phase, to the testing phase, where the participant can control the BCI. And for each bit of new data, we feed the data into the machine learning algorithm, and the algorithm says what it thinks is in the data. So we feed this bit of data in, and it says that must be right hand. And again, right hand, right hand, right hand. And we see this classifier only predicts right hand. So it might have not been the best classifier possible. What we also see here in this layout is a few of the peculiarities of BCIs. We have to collect, usually have to collect the training data right before using it. So the more training data we collect, usually the better the decoding model gets. But that also means the longer the participant or patient has to sit there before they can actually do the testing. This also shows that this training phase of our classifier is in between the training and the testing phase. So the patient again has to wait. If my machine learning model now takes 7.5 days on 25 GPUs to train, the patient is going to be very demotivated to ever use a BCI again. So these are things we need to keep in mind that are different from normal BCI, from normal machine learning use in BCI. So I've summarized some of the peculiarities of BCIs here. For all of you who have worked with neural data before, you know that the signal to noise ratio in all neural recordings is horrible. Even if you have the best invasive recordings, the signal to noise ratio is horrible and much worse than, say, in an image for image classification or in speech for speech classification. At the same time, we often have very high dimensionality. So for example, a standard EEG recording has 32 channels of very fast EEG signals. One of the things that makes BCIs really special is the variability. The data we use in our recordings is changing over time. So when I record EEG data for 10 hours, the data is going to look very different at the beginning to the end. So I always have to find this balance, because the more data I collect, the better. But also the more data I collect, the more different the data is going to be at the end compared to the beginning. This variability is even larger between sessions. So if I put on an EEG head today and put it on again tomorrow, the data is going to look very different. And it's often very, very difficult to use data from one day to the next. And what is even more different is the data between different participants. In speech recognition, it's no problem to train a model on a lot of different speakers. In BCI, this is extremely difficult. And to illustrate this, I brought you a picture on the right-hand side of two brains I 3D printed. One of the brains is mine, the other one I printed for one of my students. And you can see how vastly different they look. Well, in this one, I didn't remove the support structures yet. In this one, I peeled them off. But still, in the gyri and sulci, you can see how very different these brains are. So you can already tell that signals measured on this brain will vary greatly from signals measured on that brain, let alone sensor position, skin conductivity, thickness of the skull, and so forth. Because the variability is so large, this results in the fact that in BCI research, we mostly work with tiny data. So all of the world is about big data and collecting more and more images to train. But we usually face problems in the tiny data domain because we have to find this balance between training time and variability. We often have only a very few number of samples for each class. And we also have the limitation that our algorithms in training and decoding need to be fast. Coming back to this slide, again, if I have an hour of training phase where I collect the necessary data, and then my machine learning takes 2.5 days to train, the patient's data is going to look very different, but the patient is also going to be really annoyed by you. Similarly, if the decoder takes 5 minutes to decode every sample of data, and I want a decision every second, I'm going to have a very large delay very quickly. So this is another thing that's special in BCI compared to many other BCI machine learning domains. I would like to now go into some of the models we can use for BCI and some of the special things that are important to keep in mind. In BCI, because we have these particularities, it's often great to use very simple models as opposed to super complex models. And a method that has been used very regularly, even in current literature, is template matching. In template matching, what I do is I save the training data, and for every new sample of data I want to classify or regress, I just compare that new sample to my training data with some sort of metric. We can use whatever metric you prefer and what is good for your problem, and then just compare it to all the training data and pick the one that is most similar. I'm going to show you an example from the fantastic handwriting decoding paper I have referred to so often already. So the feature space is projected into 2D space here. So imagine now we have a new sample we want to classify and say it lands here in the feature space. What template matching does now, it compares this new sample to all previous sample, and then it says, okay, this one is most similar, closest in feature space to the Z, so the participant must have drawn a Z here. We can improve template matching methods, for example, by averaging over all Z's and O's and D's and so forth to make a more robust template, but the method stays the same. And as you can see in these 3 examples I picked from 2018, 2019, and 2020, this method is still used in very high-profile publications. So it sounds simple, but it's very, very powerful in BCI research. We can easily extend this method by not only looking at the 1 nearest neighbor, but looking at the k nearest neighbors and taking the majority class of these. So now again, imagine our new sample we want to classify is here, and we look at the 5 nearest neighbors. So then the 5 nearest neighbor for this points are this one, this one, this one, this one, and this one. So the classifier will say, I've got 2 times E in the neighborhood and 3 times Z. So this new sample must be a Z. This usually is a bit more robust than just looking at the one nearest neighbor. I know this sounds trivial, but given all the limitations we have in BCI, these template matching methods are often the most powerful ones we can use. If we don't want to use such simple methods, we can use linear models, which is still very robust. So the idea in linear models for classification is to find a separating hyperplane between the different classes. I'm going to illustrate what I mean. Again, imagine we have a two-dimensional feature space because everything else is hard to visualize. In BCI, of course, our feature spaces are usually much larger. Say we have beta power for each of 32 electrodes, we have a 32-dimensional feature space. Okay, coming back to this example, we have the two-dimensional feature space and we have the classes green, which is right-hand imagery, and red, which is left-hand imagery. And then we try to find a hyperplane between the two that says everything on the one hand is right-hand imagery, everything on the other hand is left-hand imagery. So the classification is then just multiplying our feature vector x, so you see all the data here, x, with all of the m features, with a weight vector theta, and add the threshold value b. And then if it's positive, it's on the one side. If it's negative, it's on the other side. And if it's 0, we're exactly on the separating hyperplane. We then get the y value for the classification and can say, okay, this was left or right-hand imagery. How do we define this hyperplane? In the linear discriminant analysis, for example, we find this by calculating the means for both classes and the covariance matrices. And it's important to keep in mind, and I want to point this out here, that the covariance matrix has the dimensionality of the feature space squared. So if I have 30 features from my 32 features from my 32 electrodes, the covariance matrix already is 32 times 32 large. Now imagine how many samples in the training phase I have to collect to estimate such a large matrix reliably. This is really important to keep in mind. Linear models for classification, of course, can be used for more than 2 classes. We can do this by training a lot of 1 versus 1 classifiers. So say we have 3 classes, left hand, right hand, and foot. We can do left versus foot, left versus right, and right versus foot. And then I can majority vote which one was chosen the most often. An alternative approach is 1 versus many. So I have left foot versus the other 2, right foot versus the other 2, right hand versus the other 2, and foot versus the other 2. So, of course, there's other ways to find the separating hyperplane, but I like the linear discriminant analysis a lot. It's a personal favorite. And when I start a new BCI problem, I oftentimes start with the linear discriminant analysis. In regression, we can also use a simple linear model. So again, in this example, we predict the y values from the x values, so to have a 2-dimensional problem. But of course, we can predict a multi-dimensional output from a multi-dimensional input using these weights beta hat. And if we optimize this least squares approach, this linear regression using ordinary least squares, we can get this weight vector very easily. So we transpose our entire input data, multiply it with itself, take the inverse of that, multiply it with the transpose of the data again, times the labels we know from the training data. And this gives us the weight vector. Again, why do I put this formula here? Just to see how complex this gets. So again, we say we have 32 features. So we're multiplying a 32 times number of samples we collected matrix times itself, and then we have to inverse it. So we have very little data that we collected. calculate a very unreliable matrix from that, and then we have to inverse it. I mean, this just screams numerical instability. So you can already see where I'm getting with this. BCI, because of the tiny data, is hard for machine learning. The whole world is crazy about deep learning, and deep learning has revolutionized the machine learning discipline in many, many domains. Before machine learning, we've never been, before deep learning, we've never been as good in image classification, speech recognition, and a lot of other domains. A deep neural network works by feeding the input feature vector through a number of different non-linear layers. These can be convolutional or recurrent layers. There's a lot of different ways. Through a number of layers with a lot of different connections between them. And in the end, I either put out some linear layer for a regression or a softmax layer for probabilities for each individual class. As I said, this is fantastic for a lot of machine learning problems, for example, in image recognition. But these networks have millions, and I'm not exaggerating here, they have millions of free parameters that need to be trained. Now, what we had here so far were examples with, say, 30 or 60 or maybe 100 samples in the training data. So as you can imagine, training these millions of parameters with so small data often gets very unreliable. So large improvements through deep learning in BCI have yet to come. And this is often because we can only pool the data between different patients, so difficulty. The problem is when I define my models on the data, I can get more and more complex with more and more free parameters in the models. What can happen is overfitting. Overfitting is when we fit our classifier too closely or even exactly to a particular set of training data. There is a danger that it may not generalize afterwards to new data. Here's an example, a very illustrative example from one of the books I'm going to recommend later, where you can see a classification problem between salmons and sea bass, so the two fish, based on their width and the lightness of their skin. And you can see that with a simple linear hyperplane, we would be able to discriminate this very nicely. But here they show a perfectly fitted complex hyperplane, but which would very likely not be reliable. I mean, this point clearly would be a salmon, but this super complex separating plane would classified as a sea base because it's fitted too closely to these outliers. What can we do against this overfitting? In such problems, we generally meet something called the curse of dimensionality. And that is not a pirate movie. What the curse of dimensionality is that the complexity of our problem grows exponentially with the feature space dimensionality. So for each feature, I add the dimension, the complexity actually increases exponentially. To rescue us from this, we can use regularization. For the linear discriminant analysis, as I said, my favorite classifier, we can use shrinkage. And in shrinkage, we just interpolate the covariance matrices we calculate with the identity matrix. So that means we look less at the covariances and look more at the variances on the diagonal of the covariance. And the reason why I like this so much is that the optimal parameter for this shrinkage interpolation was defined in a paper by Ledois and Wolf in 2004. And the paper is called Honey, I Shrunk the Sample Covariance Matrix, which I think was a stroke of genius. We can also use regularization in regression tasks. You saw the regression tasks. So what we usually try to minimize is this cost function. So the squared error between the actual y value and the y value we get from multiplying x with our weights vector beta. By adding an additional cost term, which could be an L1 norm of the weights vector or an L2 norm of the weights vector, we imply certain specifications on the weights vector, which lead to a lower dimensionality, which also makes the estimator more robust when little data is available. As I mentioned, it's super difficult in BCI problems to use data from different patients or even different sessions for a new patient or a new session. But of course, I'm sure you agree that it would be much better if we could use all of the previously recorded data for our new participant, ideally even without having to use a training session, and just put on the measurement and start with the BCI immediately. In this case, we maybe only need to adapt our model slightly to the new user and are ready to go. If we would be able to use this, then deep learning, of course, would be much more feasible, because then we could just train on all of the patients that have been recorded previously, take all the time to train the deep net and be okay. The research into this area is called transfer learning and has a particular importance in BCI, I think. And if this is of importance for your machine learning problems, I would like to point you to this great paper by Moritz Große-Wentrup's group. As a last point I want to make before we get to the summary is that I think, especially in a technology which is at its infancy, like BCI, it's incredibly important to understand what the machine learning model does. Don't use machine learning as a black box model. I pour my data in and some output comes out and I work with it. Try to understand what your model does. And we can achieve this by interpreting the machine learning models. So I think it's important to make sure to understand what the decoding is based on. Is the decoding physiologically plausible? So for example, I brought you two visualizations of common spatial patterns for left hand and right hand imagery. And you can see immediately, this is the activity it relies on for right hand imagery. This is the activity it relies on for left hand imagery. And this makes total sense. The area fits, the contralaterality fits. This is exactly how you want it to look. Now, if you had the same problem and the decoding would rely exclusively on an electrode here, then you would very likely be decoding eye movement. And we really need to make sure that to know what our classifier is based on. For all interpretation of linear models, I refer you to this fantastic paper by Stefan Haufe et al. There is some very early stage investigations into interpretation of deep learning models for brain-computer interfaces. This study is by Miguel Angreg and myself. And this study is by Robert Schirmeister from Tonio Ball's group, who did a very large-scale EEG study with deep learning as well. If you're more interested in an interpretation of deep learning model, I refer you to this paper from Nature Communications by Lapushkin from the Berlin group, which very nicely looks at the state of the art of interpretation of deep learning models. So I think I'm okay in time. So to conclude, machine learning allows us to automatically learn multivariate patterns from data. This is not always the best. Sometimes it's better to just build a decoder ourselves based on the neuroscience knowledge we have. Whenever we decide to use machine learning, it's important to pick the model depending on the task at hand. We need to keep the training data size in mind. We need to take the training time in mind, and we need to take the decoding time in mind. There is no one model that's always the best. In machine learning, this is called the no free lunch theorem. So there's nothing that works best for everything. I also want to really give for you on the way that the interpretation of the model ensures biological feasibility and is also our opportunity to generate scientific insights in the field of BCIs. We don't want to only get an accuracy and a model that works. We also want to know why as scientists. So I think by interpreting the models, we can really generate scientific insights. And as I'm most often asked about literature recommendations, I point you to my two favorite books in machine learning, which are Pattern Classification by Duda, and Stork, and a bit more mathematical Elements of Statistical Learning by Hasty et al. If I wasn't using this background, you would see both of them standing right there behind me. I'm a huge fan. And with that, I hope I didn't talk too much, and I thank you so much for the possibility to present today, and I'm really eager to hear your questions. Thank you very much. I'm not sure how David planned this. I'm just going to go through the questions and answers one by one now. The first question we received was, can you please suggest some online courses that merge between ML, machine learning, and neuroscience? A fantastic question. I think there is a bit of a gap here. There is not one perfect online course for neuroscience and ML. There is a really fantastic neuroscience signal processing classes, a lot of really good papers, but the machine learning BCI online course, I don't know one. Maybe somebody else can recommend something. Okay, the next one is just a thank you to me. That's great. Are there any applications for non-regression machine learning in BCI? That's a good question. Actually, in practice, the classification plays a much larger role for BCIs in real life than the regression. For example, all the wheelchair control you've seen, all the spellers that are in use by patients are based on classification. So classifying left or right hand imagery, or classifying what letter in the P300 speller the user was focusing on. So yes, there's a lot of application for classification in the machine learning, in the BCI literature. Do you use Python or MATLAB in making the model? This question, I mean, I use something, but that's not the point. As the choice of the model, your application really dictates what you should use. I mean, you can use almost anything. You will get good LDA implementations in almost all programming languages. So what is important is to pick something that's easy to work with, something that's easy to interact with the application you want to control, something it's easy to get the data into, and maybe something that's easy for you to implement it in. I mean, most important is that it's correct. I personally and my colleagues, we use Python, but that's because it's convenient for us. We have a very nice interface to the data with Python. And the machine learning libraries for Python are very strong, but I believe you can as easily implement it in MATLAB or BCI 2000, so that's C++. Can you talk about differences between offline model performance and online BCI control? For example, does the best offline model always work well online? Are models inspired biology? Oh, it went somewhere. I don't know what happened.
I can read the question again.
Okay.
Can you talk about differences between offline model performance and online BCI control? For example, does the best offline model always work well online? Are models inspired by biology easier to learn?
This is a wonderful question. I love it. And the answer is offline models most often don't work best online, because the problem is what I do with offline models is I can optimize. So it might be not overfitting because I do something wrong, but it might be manual overfitting because I try so many different models and then in the end something works, but that's also overfitted. So in my experience, comparing offline results and online results is next to impossible. It's always important to first show that an offline data, it's possible. So there is enough information in the data to decode this, but then translating this to an online BCI control is a huge step. And it gets so much more difficult because I have to set everything in advance. I have to really, I can't optimize later on. I really have to set the parameters in advance. This is very similar to what we see in the rest of science with pre-registered studies. If I collect the data first and then decide what statistics I'm going to use, I'll find something. But if I pre-register which methodology I'm going to use, it's much, much more difficult to find something. So no, the offline model don't always work best. It's very hard to compare them. And biology models, biology models are robust. And robustness is one of the key things we need for online control. So oftentimes, biology-inspired models definitely work better online. I really, this is a great question.
So the next question is, would like to hear your comments on artifacts removal algorithms on BCIs? Do you use any of them? What's the current trend?
I think data cleaning, data processing and artifact removal algorithms are key to BCI performance. It's extremely important. We do at least some sort of filtering in all of our BCIs, also in the online BCIs. At least getting rid of noisy channels, trying to filter, for example, 60 Hertz harmonics, 50 Hertz harmonics. Absolutely crucial. I didn't talk about it here because for me, this is signal processing and feature extraction. I think there will be a lecture about EEG signal processing later in the next generation series. So that's why I didn't talk about this, but it's crucial and no way around it, I would say.
What's your prediction how the BCI field will progress in the coming years? That's a huge question.
It's a huge question. It's also, for me, this question is largely independent of the machine learning factor. So, David and I could talk about this for hours. So I'm going to answer it only for the machine learning part. And for the machine learning part, I think we will see more advances in the transfer learning, that data of different sessions or different participants can be pooled and more complex models can then robustly be used. So that we can make use of the large data sets we have collected in the past. And that's how much I'm going to say about this.
And would you recommend Neuromatch Academy for computational neuroscience and Neurotech X resources for BCI and signal processing?
Yeah, I can always say learn as much as you can. Neuromatch Academy is fantastic, it's huge. It is a bit more neuroscience focused though. But as I said on one of the early slides, the more you know about what's going on, the better. Neurotech X is a fantastic community, a lot of discussion going on there. They have great initiatives. So absolutely, yeah, I can recommend them.
And are there any application for non-regression machine learning in BCI?
I think I answered this one.
Okay. On motor imagery decoding, is common spatial pattern classification algorithm and linear discriminant analysis a regression algorithm?
No, linear discriminant analysis is a classification algorithm, and common spatial pattern then is a pre-processing method it's a filter basically to maximize the variance between classes.
Yeah, they're actually used most of the times in combination with each other, CSP.
Exactly. So you pre-process with common spatial or filter bank common spatial patterns, and then you classify the variance, the feature of a common spatial pattern is then the variance into the LDA.
Okay, let me go to question. Do you envision adaptive classifiers that don't require long calibration sessions as a likely direction for future BCIs?
I don't envision them because they are already used. Especially in the invasive literature, they use a lot of adaptive classifiers. They adapt over time, that start with some random noise and then adapt more. But instead of starting with random noise, they could be pre-trained on other patients or from the day before. And I think this trend will go more into other fields of BCI. So it is already in use. I think there's another next generation talk about adaptive invasive BCIs by Amy Osborne, right?
Yes. Yeah.
So that's will be a fantastic lecture. She's great. Yes, adaptive classifiers for the world.
And does LDA ultimately identify the feature selectors channels that correspond to the classes, like right or left hand?
The LDA finds a hyperplane in the feature space between the two classes. So that is a backward model. So modeling from the feature space the variable left or right hand. It's not directly clear. So to interpret this, you need to do a bit of stuff, as is described in the Stefan Haufe paper. Fantastic read. I read it once a week. A great paper. So yes, what it identifies is a normal vector of the separating hyperplane between the channels of features that discriminate. Yes.
Okay. Are there any time series analysis techniques that we can borrow from fields like econometrics?
Well, I wouldn't say we borrow them from econometrics. I would say econometrics borrows them from the same sources as us. But there are a lot of techniques that are used in both. For example, the always powerful Kalman filter. Or uncentered Kalman filters are hugely popular in econometrics, but are also very, very commonly used in BCIs. So I wouldn't say we borrow it from them, but I would say we borrow it from the same sources.
Could you perhaps describe your own methodology in choosing models and model complexities? Do you choose one model and stick to it according to the nature of the data? Or do you go through a sequence of models and choose one after evaluating its performance? You said you always start with the LDA, right? As a
this is a fantastic question, because I also make the mistake of trying this model and that model. Yes, if I have a classification problem, I always follow the idea to start simple, because in my experience, if I get a result with a simple model, there might be the opportunity to improve upon the simple model. But if I don't find any result with a simple model, it's very unlikely that I will find something with a more complex model. I also try to not overtune, and in my personal research, I try to always stick to something that makes sense from the neuroscience background. So for example, in a motor imagery classification problem, I could extract all the feature bands from 0 to 100 Hertz in 2 Hertz spins and look at all of them. First of all, the complexity will explode, as I described. And secondly, I don't expect to see much useful information above 50 Hertz in non-invasive EEG, for example. So I can throw that out. I'm also not expecting to see anything useful below 3 Hertz for a motor imagery task. So I can also just focus on the 13 to 30 hertz we know works from the literature. And this way, I'm much less prone to overfitting. So a healthy combination of neuroscience background and playing around. But again, as I said, to Jen Collins' fantastic question, comparing online and offline data is really difficult. So then making the choice which one you want to use in an online BCI is always a very difficult one.
And so especially in such a diverse field where industry and academia have to work together, what's your point of view on how maybe more people from industry, data science, machine learning should also work in labs and academia?
I think it would be fantastic to have more people work in BCI, but currently there is not a lot of money in BCI, right? I mean, there is no applications we can sell. So why would a data science company have somebody work in BCI? So what I think what we need to do is we need to show that BCI has its application, that it is useful for the patients, and that we can really profit from this research. Otherwise, it's a nice little exercise for tiny data machine learning, but will get redundant at some point. So what I think we need to do to get more people into it is proving that it's an important field. I mean, there is a lot of research doing exactly that going on, but I think this is what needs to be done to involve more people.
But let me add to that, that there have been like a number of, companies and applications that have been shown in the past couple of years. It's very recent extension with all major actors also investing in BCIs, and the market of wearables like increasing a lot in the past few years. So I think there is a great potential for industry to pick up BCI applications and make up new applications that we are maybe not looking into in research. So how about feature selection and dimensionality reduction? Do you simply use regularization, or do you recommend using feature selection methods such as filter or wrapper?
Feature selection is super important. I use it most of the time. But again, feature selection for me is more pre-processing or processing of the data. And also feature selection is very dependent on the measurement modality you're going to deal with. If you have a Utah array in the hand knob of the motor cortex, you don't need to do much feature selection. Everything is going to be relevant. If you have an EEG cap and look at P300s, you will need only very few features. So yes, feature selection is absolutely crucial, and I use it whenever necessary. Yes.
And what is your opinion on the current state of data sharing inside the scientific community?
I think it has improved a lot. When I started my PhD in January 2012, there were almost no papers that made their code, the code and the data available. There were a few open data sets, like the ever-present BCI competition. But since then, this has changed a lot. And some of the major journals now request you to make the data available. I try to make the data available as much as possible. Our most recent preprint has all of the speech-brain data available as well. I think it has improved a lot, but there's still papers saying data is available upon reasonable request. And you write to them, hey, this is a reasonable request, can I have your data? And you never hear back from them. So I think there is still a bit to go, but it has improved a lot.
And you talked about deep learning applications, and one question here is whether reinforcement learning is a good tool for developing online BCIs, using the feedback from users as a reward in that to improve the model, most probably developed as an offline one firstly. So it's about using reinforcement learning in BCI.
I think reinforcement learning can be used in BCI. I personally haven't read a lot of papers where it's used, but I think it has great potential. Yeah. And I'm sorry I didn't speak about reinforcement learning, which is an important part of machine learning, but it doesn't have a huge place in BCI so far.
Is there any BCI toolbox do you recommend to run our pipelines online as a real experiment, not only offline, only with EEG, COG, or intracortical data sets? I think this would be helpful as a student.
Yes, there is a lot of great middleware or backends to run these experiments. Personally, we use the lab streaming layer, which also has a nice series of lectures with it, which shows you how to handle the data, how to decode the data, and it works in a lot of different programming environments. So you can build code in C++, in Python, in MATLAB. There's a Unity interface, there's something to build Android apps with it. So this is our backend, lab streaming layer, and that can also be used with cheap EEG headsets, like the Open BCI headset, but can also work with state-of-the-art, very expensive EEG headsets, like from GTAC or all of the others.
Do you see that error-related potentials can be used as a valuable feedback for improvement of the classification?
Oh, yes, definitely. Error-related potentials are great. And there is some studies out there changing the classifier output if they detect an an error-related potential. So yeah, fantastic. It's really cool.
Do you think it is the noise the main problem to decode 3D trajectories from EEG? And what strategies do you think are need to work in the future, like state space modeling or?
Yes, I think we need more state space models. I'm a great fan of state space models. I mean, trajectory decoding from EEG is very difficult because it's a very intricate process. And the EEG just doesn't give us the necessary resolution. So I think we will see improvements in sensor technology in the future. I don't think this is purely an algorithm problem, that if we have better algorithms, we suddenly can decode perfect trajectories from EEG. I think this is also just not in the data.
Yeah. What do you think about the growing interest in Riemannian geometry classifiers for non-invasive BCIs?
Fantastic. It's really, really interesting work. It has a few very clever approaches, so great.
And so in terms of computational time, will it be wise to compromise accuracy? Because, you know, like I mean, I think a take on this is that in BCIs, you don't only want accuracy, but you also want the system, especially in an online system, to respond in a timely manner. It's not that the output is produced like 2 hours later.
So, I think this is exactly the type of balance we as BCI researchers have to find. We're not only optimizing on the data in terms of accuracy. There is machine learning scientists who are better at that than we are. But what we need to find is exactly this balance. What do we need for our application? How long can the patient wait? How long is the perfect window to make this decision? So there's a lot more to BCI than just accuracy. And often, yes, our application requires us to go down in accuracy for the sake of speed, for example. Yes.
Why are the brain signals at different time not the same, even if we are in the same mood or emotion?
Well, if I only knew.
Exactly.
The brain is such a complex system that we just don't understand everything that is going on. But we know that the slightest changes already change the measured activity a lot. I mean, the more invasive I go, the more stable the signals are over time. So for example, in the BrainGate trials with those implanted UTA arrays, the signals are relatively stable between, say, today and tomorrow. In EEG, that is much less so, but this is not only a question of the brain, this also depends on how much you've sweated, how clean your hair is, the general tension of the muscles in your body. So there's just so many factors influencing it. It's really hard to say. Because if we knew, we could just backward project it into the same space and it would be solved. But sadly, we don't.
So in terms of cross-validation, so we use cross-validation to estimate the performance on an unseen set of data. However, k-fold cross-validation still might be inflated, and there might be a risk of overfitting. Better approach is the nested cross-validation, which sets aside a part of the data completely until the end, and then test the performance on that. Do you recommend that approach to have a non-inflated estimation of performance? Because as you said, we already don't have many samples, and setting aside a part of data completely might not be the right thing.
Yes. I mean, because of time limitations, I simplified this part a lot. A nested cross-validation is really what you want to do. So in each fold, you have the training data, make another cross-validation to choose which model you would use, and then use that on the real test data for this fold. But it gets more and more complex, and at some stage we need to ask ourselves, how useful is this for the application I have in mind in the end? So what often happens in my studies, and I'm being brutally honest here now, is that we design a super intricate, super complicated algorithm on the offline data, and it works really nicely with nested cross-validations for parameter optimization and so forth. And then when we make the decision to go online and try it with a patient, we use an LDA again. I urge you to keep that in mind, what we do this for, because we really need it to be robust and fast in the end. But yes, for offline data analysis, the nested cross-validation is the right approach.
So final question. So about the accuracy, what is the best value for BCI applications? For example, accuracy greater than 70, 80%?
This question is actually a lot harder to answer than you would think. Because first of all, I mentioned that accuracy can get a very tricky number to interpret if you have many classes or unbalanced classes. There is a paper, an older paper by Andrea Kübler's group, who say above 70% the user feels comfortable and doesn't feel like it's wrong all the time. For me, this is oversimplification. I think it totally depends on what you're classifying and totally depends on the use case. For example, if I can classify between left and right hand motor imagery, I think we would be very frustrated for two classes if we're above 70%. We would just be super annoyed if it's wrong in almost a third of the cases. However, for the fantastic handwriting BCI, if that is correct, with 30 classes, 70% of the time, so in 30% of the classes, we have to then enter backspace again and try again. I think everybody would be super happy. So it really depends on your classification problem. How many classes, how easy is it to redo the step? How long does every trial take? I think we really have to figure that out for our BCI independently.
And also, I guess, what are the consequences of a misclassification?
Yes, yeah, very good point. I mean.
Okay, so I think it's time to wrap up this. So thank you very much for answering so many questions, for the great presentation as well, and for kicking off this next generation seminar series from the BCI Society. Thank you also to all attendees that we had today for the great questions and for your attendance. Keep an eye on the BCI Society website for the next seminar series and the other events. Feel free to join there as well. And in the meantime, thank you again, Christian Herff, for a great presentation, for being with us today.
And thank you for having me. It was a great opportunity. And I really appreciate all the effort you put into to bring the community forward. Thank you.
Thank you, and have a good day, everyone.
Bye-bye.
Bye.